So today we're going to be, well, I'm not going to be, but Lydia is going to be talking about sections B and F of the Education Healthcare Plan. And for those of you who haven't yet met Lydia, she is EHCP Queen and also solicitor, of course, at Boys Turner. So I will pass it over to Lydia to introduce herself, and we'll get started.
Oh, thank you, Sally. Um, so I'm Lydia Dunford-Anderson. As Sally said, I'm a solicitor at Boys Turner. Our team advise parents of children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. We also work with case managers, deputies, a range of professionals, and we assist through the beginning to end of the process or somewhere in between. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. Um, I'm a bit coldy, so if I sound a bit kind of nasally or cough, then I apologize. Yes, so I'm going to talk about very briefly about education, health and care plans, specifically sections B and F today. There we are. That proves it. That is our content is is going to be that. These are topics where you could easily spend a long time, on each section. We don't have that. So this will be just a little whistle-stop tour of EHCPs, an overview, and then sections B and F in particular. So I'm EHCPs, you'll hear me say a lot, and I'm taking it that this is probably a term that most, if not all of you, are familiar with. So education, health and care plans, which have been in place for about 10 years now. They followed the Children and Families Act when that came into force. Um, and to say as well, that is still the legislation that's in place. There are also, if you're interested, there's other accompanying regulations. There's the SEND regulations as well. There's the SEND Code of Practice, which kind of brings both of those together and provides a helpful sort of go-to point of reference. EHCPs are legally binding documents. Again, you're probably already aware. They are issued by a child or young person's home local authority, so where they um, ordinarily reside. And those documents are set out in sections A through to K, and there are specific requirements for each section. The broad aim of these documents is to set out the special educational needs and disability, or SEND, and the provision to meet these needs, as well as the placement and type, or at least a type of placement. So our focus on sections B and F will be on the first part of that, so the needs and the provision. EHCPs also cover health and social care if there are needs and provision in either or both of those areas. And there has to be the appendices at the end, so section K, that sets out the information gathered to inform that EHCP, sort of like a reference point to say where this information has come from. And generally, these EHCPs are reviewed annually through an annual review. Sometimes that's more frequent. Yeah, in a nutshell, that's what EHCPs are. And again, there are lots of sections, but we are going to be looking just at sections B and F. So section B, and these are sections that are related to the special educational needs and provision. So that's partly why we're focusing on them, because quite often those are the ones where They are the biggest areas of dispute or the biggest gaps, but they are also the ones that influence the placement that the child or young person will be attending and what support they'll get. So they are very important. Section B is the description of the child or young person's special educational needs, their learning difficulties, disabilities. It's very much it should cover everything. So it should be every need that's been identified. It doesn't mean that there has to be a formal diagnosis of need. Sometimes there is, and that's fine. But that's not an essential requirement. It's very much about the individual's needs assessed. This would be usually what your starting point would be that there's been an EHC needs assessment before a plan is drafted. So that is what should inform the needs. That information should have come from that assessment process. So assuming you have that and a plan has been drafted, and then section B should reflect the needs that have been identified. It's also a case that these needs can be updated through annual reviews, other reviews of the EHCP, if new needs become known or there are new diagnoses. But again, it should be kept up to date like that. But that's what should be in section B. It's something that I see is distinguishing between what a child or young person finds difficult in accessing learning rather than it setting out the support to meet that need. So if you said something like, I don't know, Sam needs adults to help them engage with, a writing task, that is describing the provision. That's saying what has to be put in place to help them. Actually, how you'd say it's a need would be Sam finds it difficult to engage in writing tasks independently or something. That's something that I do see because it actually uses the word need, that they need something. That's not saying the same as what they find difficult. So that can sometimes be a bit, you have to be quite careful of that. And I'll come on to why in a minute, because it's really about identifying what's in the correct section and what is legally enforceable to be put in place. Section B is the description of need, is not the provision to meet that need. So that's really important to clarify that the wording doesn't go murky. So often you can tweak the wording of it a bit to clarify what the difficulty is. Section B, you do also see strengths in there as well. And this is a section where, well, if there's strengths included, it's important to remember that those are not the ones that are then have provision to meet those needs, because we're saying, well, this is something they actually find they can do well or they don't struggle with. And I think they're fine to have, and you do see them. The focus does need to be making sure that the needs are clear, because that is ultimately what needs to be known, because then you have to know what provision is required to meet those needs. So that's something to bear in mind as well. It's also worth bearing in mind that sometimes I see, and others may have seen this as well, that section A quite often has a description of needs. So section A is the child or young person's views, wishes, aspirations. You often have parental views. And that will quite often include a history of the child or young person. So the kind of, any diagnosis they have, schooling, etc. But again, that section, if the needs are in that section, that's fine, but you also have to make sure they're in section B, because there's no corresponding section for A. It's just that is it. It's little standalone, not legally enforceable section. So it's just making sure that anything need-wise, difficulty-wise, that's in A you have also then got in section B. Um, you'll see that you can also have health or social care needs, or both, in section B. It depends on the individual circumstance. In those cases, you're expecting to see those if the provision needed to meet those needs is educational. So it's working a little bit backwards, but um, again, it's what's come out of the evidence through the EHC needs assessment, most likely, or through updated annual review reports. Um, and it's just bearing in mind that you can potentially have quite a broad scope of needs in section B. It should be individualized. It shouldn't be just a kind of tick box. Um, you could have two pupils who have autism, but one has difficulties one particular area, one may not. It shouldn't just be a kind of um set. And something to also um have an understanding of, which is going into the kind of the scope of needs, is the little summary I've got of the how what special educational needs are broken down into. So they're broken down into subcategories of need. So these are ones that you would expect in an EHCP in section B to be having as little subsections. Um, this follows what's in the SEND Code of Practice. It gives a very nice table. Sadly, I know the paragraph, but it's 9.69, so chapter 9, 9.69, I believe. There's a very handy table of all the EHCP sections and what they cover, what kind of examples of what you would see in them. And this is for section B. It gives the breakdown of cognition and learning, communication and interaction, social, emotional, mental health, sensory and physical, and then also kind of independence, preparing for adulthood when you're getting to beyond year 9. Those, if anyone's really interested, there's further details about those in chapter 6 of the Code of Practice. I can't remember the specific paragraph. I think it's like I want to say 6.2 something, but I could be wrong. But it is in there. It's quite easy to navigate and find. But essentially, areas of need can fall into one, some, all of those categories of need. One that's quite often important to be aware of is the social, emotional, mental health. Because even though it talks about health, and you could go, well, wouldn't that fall under the health part of an EHCP? No, this is an educational need. So it's again making sure there's no sort of kind of blanket policy type things being applied. There's no kind of set criteria of saying, well, it's talking about health. It has to be health, not educational. No, that's not true. And I'm seeing more cases where, in situations where social, emotional, mental health needs are becoming more sort of known and sort of more identified, particularly in relation to school anxiety and attendance, and you get emotional based school avoidance. There's lots of things like that now that's being sort of identified. So again, it can be very broad. Something that's important to know as well is you don't just have to have a difficulty under cognition and learning. It might be that actually academic wise, it's not too bad, or they're actually it's okay broadly, but the areas of need are greater in other parts. So their social, emotional, mental health, or sensory and physical. So it's not just it has to be across all of them. It could be more in one area, less in another area. It should be as a whole. Um, and again, this should all come back from your evidence that informed the EHCP at that point. So whether an assessment or whether it was an annual review, uh, whatever it was, it should follow that. Yeah, so it can be quite long, section B. Especially if you have the strengths as well. You can have it where there's a lot of in there. But again, it's being clear to the individual's need rather than grouping them with other pupils of the same diagnosis. And it's also, again, being aware that you're not describing provision, you're actually describing the difficulty. Provision will come on to in section F. And something that I do also see is, say, if it has followed professional assessments from an educational psychologist or another expert, sometimes you'll see references in section B to assessed at this age or on this date, assessment result was X. Um, it's again just being careful that if that context that there's context. So rather than saying they when assessed on this area, for problem solving, let's say they performed at this percentile. Well, that doesn't really help if you haven't got an age range to compare, like an age testing age to compare it with, or you haven't got, a date. So it's just again being aware of how to make it as clear what the needs are. Um, because the aim of an EHCP is that a professional, whoever it is, who's working with this child could pick this up and know, okay, this is what they find difficult. This is what they can't access learning in this respect because of these needs. So it's trying to make it clear as much as possible, and bearing in mind that the reports that have informed Section B should be in the Section K appendices. So they should be listed, not to say, and they should be listed, but also copies of those appendices are then provided or should be provided with that EHCP. So there should be points of reference if you need to, but the crucial thing is that the actual needs, the key details are in the EHCP description itself. So that's something. And that's also something to be aware of if you, again, something I find where reports are taken from a kind of almost copy paste where it says, if it's from an expert, so it's in first person, and they're saying, I found this when assessed. Well, if you put that in an EHCP, it doesn't really make sense because that EHCP it's not a report. It's meant to be bringing all this information together. So that's sort of something it doesn't need to be in first person because it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't read well. So it's again just about checking those things so it's clear, as much as it can be.
Yeah. It's so comprehensive, isn't it? But it's a lot to digest as a family too, with
Yeah,
it.
it can
As
be. Yeah, especially
yeah.
if it's your first EHCP,
Yeah.
when it's suddenly all of this
Yeah.
put
Layer
together
upon
on a
layer upon
page.
layer. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be a lot, and then it's trying to work out, well, is that in the right section? Is that describing a provision?
Gosh.
Um, Whatever it might, is that health? Is it, yeah, it can be a lot. It can.
Are there some
Uh,
questions, Janet?
No, not so far, but we
All right.
will, all of these slides will be available
So I,
after.
I just had one question, if I may. So
mm,
in terms of looking at what the objective of obviously this is, would it be actually better not to put the strengths in?
mm. So the strengths, I'm gonna actually refresh my memory because the technically it's the needs
Mm.
that's what the EHCP is designed to show, just to collate the difficulties that require that provision beyond what pupils who don't need EHCPs require. So yeah, I apologies that I don't have a more coherent answer now. I'm just refreshing my memory because um I think the strengths come into it really because from a point which I get is actually it can be quite potentially quite sort of almost disheartening to see a document where there's all these difficulties laid out and you go, oh
Of course,
my
yeah.
gosh, there's all these things which this
Mm,
just child or young person struggles with. So I from that side I completely appreciate the wanting to balance it out and to say, well, actually no, because they can do this and
mm.
that, and whatever it may be, empathy, this, that, but I think it's just it's having it in perspective to know, well, not to, dismiss those at all. But again, the purpose of the EHCP is to say what additional support is needed. And to do that, we have to know what the additional needs are. Otherwise, the document won't work. It won't serve a purpose. But if it helps afterwards, I can always, I remember there being quite a good little, I think it's the Code of Practice talks about it, but I can always send a little point of reference for it just so people have that as
Thank you.
if needed.
Thanks.
But yeah, the focus is on the need,
Yeah.
essentially. Okay, so this then follows from section B. You have to try not the lettering doesn't really sort of follow a pattern. It kind of so B and F is educational needs provision. Health is C and G for interest, and social care would be D and H. And H is split into two parts. So yes, it's broken down so it has all the needs and then it talks about provision. So F for the provision, this is really important. This is arguably the key area of an EHCP. This and placement, so section I, which isn't in this talk, but F is very, very important because this is the provision that the local authority ultimately has to deliver. So ultimately, it's on the placement that the child or young person is going to that has been named in their EHCP, pending any caveats of wording, which again would be a talk for another day. This is what has to be delivered legally. So this section is very, very important. Again, from the beginning, you want to have it where the provision, so what support is required, not need. So you don't want to see the difficulties in this area. You want to see what provision is in place to meet the difficulties in section B. And there should be provision for every need as well. So again, that can potentially make it quite long. It's meant to be, I do see repetition. I see repetition quite often because a provision might be under communication and interaction, but then you also see it under social, emotional, mental health because it's, I don't know, about like a social group or, something. From my point of view, if the provision needs to be in there once, I don't think it needs to be duplicated because section F is section F as a whole. So long as it's in there and clear, but what does need to happen is it needs to match each need in section B. So that's where you will often see the subsection heading, so cognition, learning, sensory, physical, etc. You'll see them in B. I sometimes see alternate wording versions of those, which aren't quite the same, which makes it a bit more of a faff, but you then want to have the matching wording in section F. So you can go, communication and interaction need is this. That's what they find difficult. Right, the provision to meet that need, you would then in theory look in section F under that subheading and go, okay, they're going to get this provision. In theory, that's what ideally you should be seeing. The key for this, so section B, we talked about it needing to be clear. Section F is an absolute, it has to be clear as well, because otherwise you won't know what the provision is, and then you can't tell if it's happening. So clear, specific, unambiguous. So I could talk about this for so long. There's been lots of case law decisions from tribunals, judges, first tier, upper tier, talking about well, how specific do we need to be? And broadly, I take the view that it should be as specific as you can make it based on the evidence and the individual needs. But there have been decisions which have said sometimes too much detail is not workable. Sometimes there has to be a bit of flexibility. Sometimes that's because of the individual's needs, and if those are needs which are ones that change or are potentially deteriorating or whatever it may be. So the provision might have to be flexible to accommodate that. But again, it should follow your evidence. You want to aim for things like how often, what the provision is, first off, what's actually going to happen, how often, duration, is it in a one-to-one situation? If it is, who will be delivering that? What is their level of expertise? Any training they need to have had? So, adult support is something you see which doesn't specify, is it a TA? Is it a teacher? Is it a therapist? Is it someone else? So it's that level of detail to try and get. If it's in a group, is there a maximum number? Is there an average number? Again, this is something where you would ideally go for a maximum number. So say 4, because then it's very clear if it's 4 or over 4. But again, there have been just tribunal decisions where they've said, what happens if, a pupil joins the school unplanned and then it goes to 5? Or how are you going to, is 5 so much worse than 4? And then so that potentially you look at things like staff to pupil ratio instead, because then that potentially can change. So there's potentially a lot of things where you have to try and be as specific as possible, but also bear in mind that sometimes it has to be toned down a bit, or it has to be sort of adapted slightly. Again, depending on your evidence that you have, and EHCP evidence, again, that's a whole other topic. But if that is clear and that's informing the EHCP content, then the aim is that you can take from that and go, right, well, the provision is clear. How long? 30 minutes. I'm just, making this up, but 30 minutes, one-to-one, let's say speech and language therapy with a speech and language therapist who is trained in, let's say AAC, for just an example. So that kind of level, but then you'd also have provision. You can have provision for indirect therapy. So is it a case that a therapy assistant or a teaching staff member or TA, are they delivering provision throughout the school day? So not by the therapist, but they've been trained or they've been to the sessions to deliver throughout the day to kind of continue it. There's potentially all sorts that you could have in there. Again, it comes from what your evidence says, and it is common to have the direct therapy from a therapist plus indirect, sort of continuing that provision throughout the day or for set amounts. So it can be a lot. It can be, again, it's focusing on the needs. You're focusing on if the provision is educating or training the child or young person. And again, it's going back to what the needs are, how to address those needs so that they can access learning across those 4 areas of difficulty. But independence as well, if you're looking beyond and preparing for adulthood, for year 9 and above. So it can be very broad. You can have therapies from, say, speech and language, occupational therapists is another one, physiotherapist. There might be direct input from an educational psychologist, might be clinical psychologists. You might have other therapists. Trying to think of some other music therapy. you potentially it could be very broad. Um, it's always coming back to the individual's needs, the provision that's been recommended and informed of that EHCP, and hopefully that provision is clear and specific. And uh, again, going back to the scope of need, and that can include health and social care. So if you have health or social care provision that is educating or training the child or young person, then that would also say, well, that's educational provision. So there's sometimes an overlap between provision that does both. Sometimes it's very clearly in one camp, not the other. Again, it depends on the individual's needs, the evidence. So section F is really, really important. And again, this is the one where quite often there is dispute. And it's important to remember that your starting point, the provision, so the need should be identified first, and then you identify the provision to meet those needs. And then you're technically then meant to say, well, what placement can deliver this provision to meet those needs? So it should work in an order. And it's something where if there's provision that's been detailed in section F, but say it's, speech therapy, but that particular placement says, well, we don't have a speech therapist or we don't employ one, then if the provision is clear and detailed, you then be saying, well, if you're the named placement and this provision is detailed, local authority, you need to bring that provision in to kind of fill in the gap. So it should work in that order. Sometimes it does kind of go back the other way when you have a school saying, well, we can't do this. You go, but don't worry, this can be done. Again, placement is, is potentially a whole separate topic anyway. But it's just bearing in mind that the key is to make sure the provision is clear and it meets the need rather than going sort of following what a placement can or can't provide broadly. It should be focusing on what provision has been identified, and then you kind of work from there. Because otherwise, if it's not clear and provision is sort of diluted, to kind of accommodate what a school is saying they can't provide, then you're kind of working backwards and you go, well, that's not what the EHCP is meant to do. It's meant to be adding on top of what provision is, available as standard in a maintained mainstream setting. So there's lots of things for F to think about. So yes, it's a very, very important section. And just as with section B and with the whole EHCP, it is subject to reviews annually, more frequently, sometimes less frequently, where, changes can be put forward, they might be updated. Yeah, it's a very important section and quite often the one where a lot of focus is rightly so placed. And again, it's just bearing all these things in mind. And I suppose to say that if you, depending on what stage of an EHCP you're at, there are usually options to be able to respond to it or to challenge what's in it. Again, that's a whole other topic.
Yeah, I bet you that's a whole other topic. But yeah,
It's a whole other topic, but it's not
you can
set in
challenge.
stone forever. It can sometimes feel like, well, you want to aim to try and get section F as good as it can be from the get-go,
Yeah.
because then it stands you in better stead going forward. But sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes the evidence isn't there, all sorts of reasons. So yeah, there are chances to address it, to get advice on it, to kind of reach out and go, well, I've got this. I'm not sure if this is detailed enough or it doesn't. Something actually I realize I haven't covered is if there's just reference to funding or banding, that's not, you can't just rely on that. It has to actually have the provision. So you sometimes will see, this has been allocated band C, band D funding or equivalent of this many hours of adult support. That's not the same thing as actually writing out they will need 25 hours of one-to-one TA support per week for structured time delivered by a TA with experience in, if it's the equivalent of, that's not the same thing as saying that that is specific provision. So that's something to be aware of as well, is you do see it where provision is there, and there's also the funding banding allocations also included. As long as the provision's clear, I wouldn't then worry too much about the banding, but you don't want to have it where it's just saying, well, they've been allocated the equivalent of so many hours of TA support, because that could mean the TA is there, but they're not specifically working with that individual. They might be there for the whole class. And if it's not clear that they have to be one-to-one for that particular pupil for this many hours, then that's so much harder to enforce and say, but it says it there. And again, this comes back to the individual need as well, because some pupils won't need that. But then that's where you may be looking at things like the class sizes is quite often a factor. And if the pupil to staff ratio is naturally, if there's more staff to pupil naturally, and you go, well, they don't need the one-to-one because actually there's more staff, there's fewer pupils, it doesn't. So each case is different, but it's just things to be aware of. And again, yeah, being aware of not having the specific therapy report recommendations in the first person, which is I really I find that so annoying, because it just breaks the flow of reading it when you suddenly get references to I assessed here and I found it. You don't need to do that. That's why you have the appendices. You can then go and read that report fully. But for actually section F, you just need, what are they recommending provision wise? It doesn't need to be the first person narrative. So lots. In a nutshell, there's a lot in section F.
Can I pop in with a question?
Of course.
Amber, thank you. If the needs assessment shows that assault may be required, for example, it is written down for the EHCP, and if schools say they don't have assault, who would step in to ensure that provision is met? The LA? Question mark.
Yes. So if there is speech and language therapy provision in the EHCP and F, if it's clear, if it says that the provision has to be delivered by a speech and language therapist, so that's one thing, rather than saying, it's a therapy assistant or it's a staff member. If it is, no, it has to be a therapist to deliver this, then yes, you'd be saying to the LA, well, you need to get a speech and language therapist who meets these requirements as per whatever the EHCP says to deliver this provision for, again, whatever the detail is. So yes, provided it's clear, then it makes it easier to say, well, you need to fill in the gap and find this therapist. There's also, you sometimes have to distinguish between the need for therapists to be on site at a school or not. And again, that comes from your evidence that's informed the EHCP, hopefully. So it might be cases where it's, well, we need a speech and language therapist, but there's no requirement they have to be on site. It's where they come in to do an hour a week direct provision. Okay. If it has to be an on-site therapist, then that is obviously a different requirement. But again, it depends on the individual evidence. It depends on how it's worded. So yeah, just something to bear in mind.
No more questions.
Any more questions?
If I know you always sort of got my details are there, but if there was anything afterwards, then people are very welcome to reach out to me, and I'll do my best to assist if I can.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, we'll share the when this has been, the recording is uploaded, we'll share the link to that, but also to the slides as well, so that people can have that with your details on. And we have got some more webinars coming up, but just to say that the one that was planned for December has been postponed. And I will let Lydia explain a little bit more about why that's been postponed.
So, again, this is something that all of you, none of you may be kind of aware of, but there is been kind of ongoing talks about reviewing the send process, and there have been reports that have come out, government reports, and essentially there is a white paper that is now expected for early next year, I believe. I don't know more specifically than that. So yes, it made sense to just wait, because when that comes out, no doubt there will be lots of things to consider for us as professionals in who you advise on this area, but also for you as parents as well. So I think for that we'll just need to keep an eye on as and when that comes out, and then to kind of take stock and go, right, what is it actually? What's it saying? Essentially, what do we need to be aware of? So that was that. But yes, I'm sure Sally will keep everyone
Yeah,
updated anyway.
we'll keep you updated and everything. So yeah, super. Good. And then we have the one in January and then the one in February as well. But again, we'll send out links to everybody so that everybody can make sure that they can join those if they wish to. So thank you very much again, Lydia. That's lots of information that you gave us there, and I hope that was useful for everybody who's joined. And thank you everybody for joining. It's always nice to have a good crowd that has joined these webinars. And thank you, Janet, for your reading out the questions and everything.
Wonderful.
So yeah.
Thanks.
Super. And if you, we will send you out these details, so you'll have Lydia's contact details. So anybody watching, if you do have a question that you would like to ask Lydia directly, then you can feel free to message her. And thank you very much for joining us. And we hope to see you again next time. And yeah, bye for now.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Sally. Bye.